You might have heard this story. A young, hotshot army captain, newly arrived to the Great Plains, claims to everybody within earshot, "Give me 80 men and I will ride through the entire Sioux Nation." He is so blinded by his own superiority complex that, when fate happens to give him this exactly specified amount of soldiers, he immediately disobeys his commanding officer's orders, which ends up with him and his men surrounded by a swarm of hostile Indians. As all of his men die around him, he commits suicide with another officer, rather than fall into the Indians' hands. It's a classic tale of an arrogant man getting his comeuppance, and tragically dragging 80 others down with him. But just how truthful is this portrayal of the Fetterman Fight? It's the mid-1860s, and the Civil War is finally over. People are ready to move on from the hardships brought on by the war, and many are looking westward. During the war, gold was discovered in southern Montana, and now that word has spread. The most direct route to these gold fields lies through northeast Wyoming, east of the Bighorn Mountains. This country is known as Absarica, after the Indians who have called this area home. In recent years, the Absarica, also known as the Crow, have been pushed out by neighboring Lakota and Cheyenne tribes. With the new Bozeman Trail cutting through the area, the Army has decided to construct 3 forts along the trail. These forts will serve as way stations and protect people using the trail. It's supposed to be a comfortable, laid-back assignment. Commanding General William Sherman even encourages the Army officers to bring their wives and families. The man in charge of these forts is Colonel Henry Carrington, commander of the U.S. 18th Infantry Regiment. Before the war, he was a lawyer. Nobody doubts his intelligence. But here's the thing. He spent the war doing recruiting drives and handling administrative tasks, away from his regiment. He's never actually seen combat. Carrington organizes his regiment, and in July 1866 begins moving along toward his posts. At Fort Laramie, where the U.S. government is attempting to negotiate with the Lakota, the chiefs, led by Red Cloud, take one look at Carrington's arriving wagons and quickly realize the government's intentions. Before negotiations can continue, the Indians angrily leave and swear to attack any settler they see. Red Cloud's war has begun. Carrington's newly established forts quickly enter a sort of siege state, where Indian attacks are common, and leaving the fort by yourself is a virtual death sentence. Enter William Fetterman. Like Carrington, Fetterman used the Civil War as an opportunity to join the Army as an officer, something he had always wanted to do. Unlike Carrington, though, Fetterman had gotten his hands dirty on the battlefield. Fetterman served in the Western Theater and had been part of Sherman's March to the Sea. He had led men in multiple battles and had a reputation as a chivalrous, capable soldier. As Fetterman arrives at Fort Phil Kearny in early November, he quickly realizes the raw state many of the recruits are in. He sets to training his company in daily musketry drills. After a skirmish claims the lives of 2 soldiers, Fetterman remarks to his superior officer, "This Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight, requiring the utmost caution." Carrington is complimentary of Fetterman in his reports from this time, noting that Fetterman carries out orders promptly and to the letter. He also praises Captain Frederick Brown, the regiment's quartermaster. Captain Brown has a reputation for taking every opportunity to chase down Indian warriors who try to steal the fort's cattle and horses. He has orders to leave the fort soon, though, and wants one last chance to get an Indian scalp. Carrington is less complimentary toward Lieutenant George Grummond, who leads the fort's mounted infantry. Grummond is a Civil War veteran, but has a history of impulsivity bordering on recklessness. Grummond had been reprimanded several times during the war for making hasty decisions. During a skirmish on December 6th, Carrington had to order Grummond to either follow orders or go back to the fort. Grummond ended up chasing a small Indian band who then ambushed him, nearly killing him. Grummond is accompanied by his wife, Frances, who is pregnant. As the weeks go on, an unspoken rift develops between Carrington and his officers. Everyone knows that Carrington's orders are to mount a winter campaign, while the Indian ponies are believed to be weak from the lack of grass. Yet Carrington appears reluctant to do so. Fetterman and Brown devise a plan to take 60 mounted soldiers and 40 citizens to the Tongue River to mount an offensive against the Indian villages camped there. But the cautious Carrington refuses the plan, who thinks it will waste the fort's horses and supplies. Yet Carrington still reports to his commanding officer, "I am perfecting all details of the post and preparing for active movements." On the morning of December 21st, Carrington sends a wagon train, escorted by a fairly strong guard, almost 90 men, to an area called the Pinery, a few miles west of the fort. This train leaves almost daily and collects lumber to use as fuel and for constructing the fort. At around 11 in the morning, observers on a hill south of the fort indicate the wagon train is under attack and has circled its wagons. Carrington immediately moves to send 50 of the fort's infantry to relieve the wagon train. Fetterman requests the job. Lieutenant Grumman asks to take out the cavalry and is given command of 27 troopers. Captain Brown, scheduled to leave in a day or two, decides to join the detail. Finally, 2 civilian frontiersmen, Isaac Fisher and James Wheatley, volunteer to go. They are carrying Model 1860 Henry repeating rifles, the most advanced rifle at the time. The relief force numbers 81 men, and although some of them are recruits, many are seasoned Civil War veterans. According to Carrington's report, he orders Fetterman, "Support the wood train, relieve it, and report to me. Do not engage or pursue Indians at its expense. Under no circumstances pursue over the ridge, namely Lodge Trail Ridge, as per map in your possession." Crucially, this does not give Fetterman any specific guidance on how he is to support the train. After a quick inspection, Fetterman sets off with the infantry. As Lieutenant Grumman leaves the fort to catch up to Fetterman's infantry, Carrington tells him, "Report to Fetterman, obey orders, and do not leave him." Carrington yells this last order to Grumman from the sentry walk of the stockade. Instead of moving west toward the beleaguered wagon train, Fetterman immediately moves northward along the southern face of Lodge Trail Ridge. It appears that Fetterman is trying to get in a position behind the Indians attacking the wagon train. This is a tactically smart move, and even Carrington, in his report, says Fetterman wisely moved this direction. Grumman's cavalry soon catches up with Fetterman. As Fetterman continues northward, the observers report that the attack on the wagon train has stopped, and it was continuing toward the Pinery. Fetterman's command spies a group of 10 hostiles and begins pursuing them. Around noon, he is last seen on Lodge Trail Ridge, near where the Bozeman Trail crosses the crest. Almost immediately, the fort's occupants begin hearing gunshots that rapidly pick up in pace. Carrington sends Captain Tenador Tenek with an additional 40 men to support Fetterman. Instead of following Fetterman's route, Tenek makes his way to a knoll just east of Lodge Trail Ridge, which allows him a view of the other side. Once there, he sends a messenger back to Carrington, advising there are large bodies of hostile Indians on the other side of the ridge, challenging his men to come and fight. He sees no sign of Fetterman. Carrington sends reinforcements towards Tenek with the words, "You must unite with Fetterman. Fire slowly and keep men in hand. You could have saved 2 miles towards the scene of action if you had taken Lodge Trail Ridge." By the time they arrived, the Indian warriors had left to the north, leaving nothing but piles of naked and mutilated bodies. Fetterman's entire command lays dead along a mile-long spur that protrudes north of Lodge Trail Ridge. How did this happen? Based on Indian accounts and accounts of the soldiers who located the bodies, the last movements of Fetterman's command can be roughly reconstructed. Fetterman's command was last seen from the fort on the top of Lodge Trail Ridge, in good order, with the cavalry and mounted infantry flanking the infantry. They had been pursuing a small group of 10 warriors. Little did they know this group was actually a decoy party, designed to lure the soldiers into a prepared ambush. On the ridge crest, some type of triggering event occurred that resulted in the cavalry and mounted infantry chasing a decoy party down the north side of Lodge Trail Ridge. Maybe the decoys were finally too much temptation for the troopers to bear, and they broke ranks after them. Maybe Lieutenant Grumman ordered the mounted soldiers to pursue the decoys, or perhaps Wheatley and Fisher were the ones who initiated the chase. At any rate, the mounted soldiers, more than half of Fetterman's force, rode off after the Indians, with the infantry following along the Bozeman Trail as best they could. The chase continued for about a mile, as the soldiers sporadically fired their carbines at the fleeing Indians. Just south of the Pino Creek ford, the decoy party suddenly changed direction, crisscrossing each other's paths. This was the signal for the Indians to spring their trap. Within seconds, nearly 2,000 Indians rode from behind ridges and out of ravines surrounding the spur. The horse Captain Brown had ridden out from the fort was found dead near the creek, indicating how far north some of the soldiers had ridden. With hundreds of Indians now appearing around them, all thoughts of pursuing the Indians were abandoned. The key was to seek cover and hold on long enough for reinforcements to arrive. A small group of men, perhaps a little less than a dozen, took cover around some rocks at the northern base of the spur. Among these men were the civilians, Wheatley and Fisher. Their repeating rifles allowed some time to regroup, and soldiers would later mention seeing dozens of spent cartridge casings around their bodies. Their volume of fire accounted for many of the Indian casualties, and after the fight ended here, their bodies would be singled out for severe mutilation. Along the crests of the spur, less experienced cavalry soldiers were galloping back south toward what they thought was safety with the infantry. Here, though, the trap had been sprung as well, by Cheyenne and Hunkpapa Indians. These groups converged on the infantry, making their way along the Bozeman Trail. The Indian warriors rapidly closed with the infantry, surrounded them, and killed them in hand-to-hand fighting. Today, a stone tower marks the place where the soldiers made their last stand. Credit for killing Fetterman is given to the chief American Horse, who stated he had knocked the soldier off his horse, stunning him, and then cut his throat. Among the soldiers here, Captain Brown's body was located, with what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his temple. Only a handful of the soldiers were found with gunshot wounds, most being killed by arrows or hand-to-hand weapons. Between these 2 points lay a ragged string of cavalry troopers. Among them was Lieutenant Grummond, who died near a hill between the Wheatley-Fisher rocks and the infantry position. Fetterman had now gone into history, but what would become of his legacy? Days after the battle, the Army relieved Colonel Carrington of command of Fort Phil Kearny. He had been in overall command of the fort, and the Army was ready to place responsibility for the disaster on him. But Carrington would not accept such a stain on his reputation so easily. He gathered witnesses, including his wife and Grummond's widow, who advised they had heard Carrington give orders multiple times not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge. And it was true. After all, Fetterman's men were all found north of the ridge, where he had been ordered not to go by Carrington. 2 years after the battle, Fetterman's wife Margaret wrote the book Absarika, Home of the Crows. After her death in 1870, Carrington married Grummond's widow, Frances, who also wrote a book praising her new husband's performance, while also honoring the memory of her first husband. These books served to germinate the first seeds of myth surrounding the fight. Both women painted Carrington, Tenek, and Grummond in the best possible light, while portraying Fetterman as a gallant but egocentric officer, new to the ways of plains warfare. They reinforced the idea that Fetterman disobeyed orders, and his motivation for that defiance settled on Fetterman's ambition. As an example, both women attributed Fetterman as saying, "A company of disciplined regulars could wipe out 1,000 Indians." This was a common boast among many young Army officers in the West. The first mention of the 80 men quote attributed to Fetterman comes from around 1908, more than 40 years after the fight. Think about it, what is more probable? That Fetterman claimed to need only 80 men, which, coincidentally, he was then exactly provided with? Or that the quote was invented after the battle, when Fetterman had died with exactly 78 soldiers and 2 civilians under his command? Or take the mutual suicide of Fetterman and Brown. In later tellings of the tale, Fetterman and Brown were said to have killed each other with revolver shots to the temple, rather than be butchered by the Indian warriors. This flies in the face of the actual evidence. Although Brown's body was found with what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head, and he had frequently mentioned he would rather kill himself than be taken captive by the Indians, no gunshot wound was recorded as being present on Fetterman by the post-surgeon. And only a few of the dead were killed by gunshots. Most were killed by arrows or hand-to-hand weapons. In contrast to Carrington, Fetterman was an orphan and a bachelor, with no children, and nobody who could refute these assertions. It's important to note that the Army kept a favorable view of Fetterman. In July 1867, they named a fort in East Wyoming in his memory. As the decades progressed, however, the narrative pushed by families intent on securing their legacies began to take hold in popular culture. Historians, swayed by the Carrington lady's accounts and by interviews with Carrington himself, adopted the biased view of Fetterman's legacy. By the early 20th century, the arrogant Fetterman narrative had become set in stone, with no living witnesses to counter it. The Fetterman Fight was a defining moment in the Plains Indians' wars. Among its many lessons, we see how facts can be subtly changed to suit a prevailing narrative, pushed by people with an agenda, which, left unchecked over time, can become conventional wisdom. Following the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, Fort Phil Kearny was abandoned. Shortly after, Cheyenne Indians burned it to the ground. Fetterman and his men were initially buried at Fort Phil Kearny, but were reinterred at Custer National Cemetery at the Little Bighorn Battlefield in 1888.